Black veteran thought no one would recognize him. Then a young SEAL saw his tattoo and froze. The menu typed on the tablet shook in the waiter's hands as his gaze darted between the manager and the 76-year-old black man sitting alone at the corner table. The Harborside restaurant, known for its exclusive clientele of military personnel from the nearby naval base, was particularly busy that night. "Sir, I'm sorry to inform you that we've received complaints about your presence," the waiter muttered, avoiding eye contact with Samuel Washington. "The manager suggests that you might be more comfortable at another establishment." Samuel remained unperturbed, his dark eyes focused on the small glass of whiskey in front of him, the only drink he allowed himself on the anniversary of the operation that changed his life forever. The left sleeve of his shirt was discreetly rolled up, revealing a deep scar, and just below it, a faded tattoo, a trident crossing an anchor, almost invisible against his dark skin. At the next table, 3 younger officers watched the scene, whispering between suppressed laughs. "I bet he bought that veteran badge on the internet," one of them commented loud enough to be heard. "He's using our veteran discount without ever having served." Typical. Samuel didn't react. In the 50 years since he'd returned from Vietnam, he'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting. His mind wandered momentarily to the Mekong River, to the faces of the 16 men he'd saved on that rainy night in 1968. None of them were alive now to tell the story. "With all due respect, sir," the manager approached, his voice artificially polite. "Our customers are uncomfortable. Perhaps you could show some military identification." "I lost my ID a long time ago," Samuel replied calmly. Not mentioning that the records of Operation Rivergate remained classified, that his Special Tactical Reconnaissance Unit rarely appeared in official documents, and that black men in special forces during the Vietnam War often remained invisible in the historical record. The restaurant had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Samuel began to rise slowly, his joints protesting with decades of pain, when the door to the establishment swung open. Lieutenant Marcus Riley, 28, entered wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a plain t-shirt. His eyes scanned the room, detecting the tension in the air before he even understood the scene. Then his gaze fixed on the partially visible tattoo on Samuel's arm. Riley froze as if he had seen a ghost. "Impossible," he whispered, slowly advancing towards Samuel's table. The silence in the restaurant intensified as Riley stopped 2 steps away, studying the aged face in front of him with an expression of growing recognition. "Sir," he asked, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "That tattoo, were you in MACVS? Operation Rivergate?" Samuel stared at the young man with sudden intensity. No one had mentioned that operation in decades. No one should even know it existed. "Who are you, son?" Samuel asked, each word carefully measured. Riley stood firm, almost at attention. "Lieutenant Marcus Riley, SEAL Team 6. Sir, my grandfather was John Whiskey Riley." An almost imperceptible tremor passed over Samuel's face. John Riley had been the only other man to survive that night on the river. The man who had carried Samuel 3 kilometers with a makeshift tourniquet after a mine had destroyed his arm. Lieutenant Riley absorbed the silence in the restaurant, slowly realizing the scene he had interrupted. His eyes darkened as he understood what was happening. "Manager," his voice cut through the air like a knife. "The man standing in front of you has a higher security clearance than anyone in this establishment. If this is the man I think he is, you are about to make the biggest mistake of your lives." In Samuel's tired eyes, something flashed that hadn't been there in a long time. A glimmer of recognition, perhaps even hope. But there was something else there, something that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd faced such a situation, nor would it be the last. If this story of belated recognition and prejudice touched you, be sure to sign up to the Black Voices channel to find out how a single moment can reveal secrets kept for 50 years and forever change an entire community's understanding of heroism and sacrifice. The silence in the restaurant was as thick as fog on a battlefield. Marcus Riley stood his ground in front of Samuel Washington while the other customers watched the scene with a mixture of confusion and growing discomfort. "I'm sure there's some mistake," the Harborside manager interjected, trying to regain control of the situation. "This gentleman has not presented valid military identification," and Riley interrupted with a bitter laugh. The man you're trying to throw out of your establishment participated in operations that remain classified to this day. His name is probably still blacked out on documents locked away in the Pentagon." Samuel watched the young SEAL with an unreadable expression. 50 years of keeping secrets had created a man whose thoughts rarely showed on his face. But something in Riley's eyes, so much like his grandfather's, awakened a long-buried memory. "Perhaps we should talk in private," Samuel suggested quietly, rising from his chair with deliberate movements. The obvious effort to hide the pain in his aging joints was part of a lifetime of disguising weakness from those who expected to see it. Riley nodded, but before they walked away, he turned back to the manager. "His tab is paid. For all of us at Table 5, he said, pointing to a group of younger SEALs watching the situation with growing interest. "And I strongly suggest you reconsider your ID policy." On the small outdoor deck of the restaurant overlooking the harbor, Samuel finally spoke. "John Riley had a nickname, one that's not in any official record." "Silent Ghost," Marcus replied immediately. "My grandfather spoke little about Vietnam, but he mentioned that name in his nightmares." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. "We were part of a special unit. Covert ops, mostly in the Meon Delta. Officially, we never existed." "Operation Rivergate," Marcus finished. 16 men saved when his boat was ambushed on the Cambodian border." Samuel studied the young man with renewed intensity. "How do you know that?" "Those files should be buried forever. My grandfather left a letter to be opened when I completed my first mission as a SEAL. He described how a black operator named Shadows saved the entire unit when the commander was killed." Marcus hesitated. "He said the government denied him his Medal of Honor because of the color of his skin." Samuel looked away toward the horizon where Navy warships cut through the waves in the distance. "That was a long time ago." "Not for the Pentagon," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. 3 months ago, I started a process to retroactively recognize black operators who were denied military honors during Vietnam. A personal project of mine." For the first time that night, Samuel's expression registered genuine surprise. "Why?" "Because my grandfather died believing he saved 16 men that night. I found out there were 17. He just forgot to count himself." In the restaurant, the officers who had previously mocked Riley watched through the window, trying to decipher the conversation. One of them, Captain Warren, a battalion commander, frowned at the intimacy with which Riley was talking to the old man. "What's Riley's problem?" he muttered to his companions. "Wasting time with some old man." Meanwhile, on the deck, Riley showed Samuel documents on his phone, scanned pages of military records, testimonials, medical reports. "During my training to become an instructor, I got temporary access to the Vietnam-era files. I documented everything before they noticed." A conspiratorial smile crossed his face. "The world needs to know the truth about the black Special Forces operators of that era." "It won't change anything," Samuel replied, his voice heavy with a resignation built on decades of silent injustice. "Some of us just weren't meant for the spotlight of history." "I disagree, sir." "And I'm not alone," Riley replied, sliding his finger across the screen to show a group of former military personnel, most of them black, in formal uniform. "The Retroactive Recognition Committee, veterans fighting to right the injustices of the past. We need your testimony." Samuel looked at the photos with an expression that mixed skepticism and something else, an almost extinguished spark of hope. For a moment, the old operator seemed lost in internal calculations, weighing risks and possibilities, as he had done countless times in hostile territory. Captain Warren, unable to contain his hostile curiosity, appeared in the deck door. "Riley, we need to get back to base. Leave the gentleman alone." The condescending tone did not go unnoticed. Riley straightened his shoulders, but before he could respond, Samuel raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that Riley instinctively recognized as a tactical signal to wait. "Captain," Samuel said with studied softness, "I believe we haven't been formally introduced." Warren hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't think that's necessary." Samuel smiled then, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. For those who knew men trained in combat, that expression was a clear warning. "Perhaps you're right, but I'm sure we'll meet again in very soon." There was something in the way Samuel said those words, a quiet certainty that made Warren instinctively retreat. The captain muttered an excuse and withdrew, leaving a palpable tension in the air. Riley watched the interaction with fascination. "You still have that presence. My grandfather said you could make a man reconsider his choices without saying a threatening word." Samuel rose slowly. "Your initiative is admirable, son. But believe me when I say that some ghosts from the past prefer to remain buried." As he walked away, Riley noticed something the others had missed. The way Samuel had discreetly studied every exit, every person, every detail of the room. The old warrior remained vigilant even after 50 years. "Mr. Washington," Riley called. "The memorial is being unveiled next week. Thursday, Norfolk Naval Base. All known survivors will be there." Samuel paused but did not turn. His entire body seemed to carry the invisible weight of memories that few could understand. "Some of us," Riley continued, "believe that certain stories need to be told, no matter how much time has passed, especially those that were deliberately erased." Samuel Washington finally looked over his shoulder, his gaze meeting not only Riley's, but also that of the group of officers watching from the window. For a fleeting moment, something dangerous and calculating flashed in the old soldier's eyes, like a predator sizing up its prey before an inevitable attack. "Perhaps you're right, son," he replied with a calmness that masked a deep resolve. "Perhaps it's time to dig up certain secrets. And when the truth comes out, some men will learn that underestimating a warrior is the first step to defeat." The following Thursday, the Norfolk Naval Base was decked out for the dedication of the Southeast Asia Covert Operators Memorial. Samuel Washington arrived discreetly wearing a simple but impeccable suit. After his conversation with Riley, he had spent 3 days revisiting files stored in a metal box under his floorboards. Unofficial reports, yellowed photographs, letters never sent. Captain Warren intercepted him at the entrance. "Mr. Washington, I'm afraid this is a closed ceremony. Only authorized military personnel and guests with credentials." Samuel smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." The moment was interrupted by Rear Admiral Phillips, who approached directly. "Captain Warren, I see you've already found our guest of honor." Warren blinked, confused. "Sir, Samuel Shadows Washington." The Admiral extended his hand with palpable respect. "It's an honor to finally meet you." The transformation on Warren's face was instantaneous, from arrogance to utter confusion. Samuel was escorted to the front row while Warren remained frozen, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare. On the central platform, a tarp covered what appeared to be a commemorative plaque. Beside it, 5 elderly men, all in their 70s, stood at attention. "The Rivergate survivors," Riley explained quietly. "They all agreed to break their silence when they learned you were alive." Admiral Phillips introduced Lieutenant Riley, who stepped onto the stage with steady strides. "For decades," he began, "the story of special operations during the Vietnam conflict has been told incompletely, particularly when it came to black operators on classified missions." A large screen lit up displaying documents and photographs. A group of 8 men armed and dressed for jungle combat. Among them, recognizable even 5 decades later, was Samuel Washington. On March 12, 1968, a tactical reconnaissance unit was ambushed in the Myeong Delta. The commander was killed in the first few seconds. 16 men were trapped under heavy fire with no communication. The photograph changed to an old tactical map with handwritten markings. Sergeant Samuel Washington, the unit's only black operator, took command. Using his superior knowledge of river navigation and improvised communication techniques, he not only organized an effective defense, but also created an extraction route through territory considered impenetrable. Riley paused, his voice growing intense. 16 men were rescued that night. Among them was my grandfather, John Whiskey Riley, who survived thanks to a tourniquet applied by Sergeant Washington while they were still under enemy fire. Captain Warren, now at the side of the auditorium, looked physically ill. A recommendation for the Medal of Honor was made, Riley continued, but it mysteriously disappeared in the bureaucratic channels. The official records eventually listed the operation as partially successful without mentioning Sergeant Washington's crucial role. Admiral Phillips resumed the microphone. Today, we correct a 50-year-old mistake. The tarp was removed, revealing a bronze plaque where Samuel Washington's name headed the list of operators. Below it, in a sealed glass case, lay a Medal of Honor. Sergeant Samuel Washington, for his extraordinary bravery beyond the call of duty, it is my honor to present you, albeit 50 years late, with this nation's highest military decoration. The auditorium erupted in applause as Samuel, visibly moved for the first time, took the stage. When he was offered the microphone, everyone expected a speech about injustice. Instead, Samuel looked out at the audience with quiet dignity. John Riley carried me 3 miles after I stepped on that mine. When I woke up in the hospital, he was there. He said he needed to thank me for saving his life, and I told him we were even. Samuel paused, his eyes meeting Marcus. He promised me that one day the truth would be known. Today, his grandson has fulfilled that promise. Admiral Phillips called Warren to the stage. Captain Warren recently demonstrated a lapse in judgment regarding Sergeant Washington. Captain, you'll be the officer in charge of ensuring that the story of Operation Rivergate is included in the training curriculum for all new recruits. After the ceremony, Samuel approached Riley. I realized from the moment you recognized me at the restaurant that you had your own plan in motion. You knew I would be there that night, didn't you? Riley nodded, finally revealing his strategy. I found your address in the declassified files. I knew you frequented that restaurant every year. I arranged everything with the Admiral weeks ago, but I needed witnesses to see how you were treated to maximize the impact of the historical correction. Samuel added, recognizing the tactical elegance. Your grandfather would have approved. On the same base where his contribution had once been erased from the official records, Samuel Washington now had his name engraved in bronze, a permanent testament to the fact that history, though it may be temporarily distorted, eventually finds its way back to the truth. 6 months after the ceremony at Norfolk Naval Base, Samuel Washington's life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The man who had lived in the shadows for decades had ironically become a guiding light for an entire generation of military personnel. The small house where he lived, once rarely visited, now regularly welcomed young recruits, elderly veterans, and occasionally high-ranking officers who came seeking his wisdom. On the wall of his living room, next to his newly framed Medal of Honor, hung a black and white photograph, the original Operation Rivergate team, taken days before that fateful mission on the Mekong. I never expected to live to see this day, Samuel remarked as he poured coffee for Marcus Riley, who had become a frequent visitor. I spent so long believing that some stories just aren't told. Riley smiled, glancing at the stack of letters on the coffee table, correspondence from military personnel and civilians across the country, many sharing their own stories of unrecognized service. Admiral Phillips told me that your case set a precedent. Dozens of other veterans are being re-evaluated now, especially Black and Hispanic operators who served in special units. The most surprising news, however, had come just 2 weeks earlier. The Secretary of Defense had appointed Samuel to a special advisory committee charged with reviewing historic policies of discrimination in the military. It was a role that brought not only recognition but real authority to change broken systems. Meanwhile, Captain Warren faced his own journey of consequences. His mandatory presentations on Operation Rivergate at the Naval Academy had initially been botched. His resistance to fully acknowledging the historical injustice evident to everyone in attendance. However, something unexpected began to happen during the third presentation. Repeatedly confronted with the undeniable truth of the records, forced to study in detail the courage and sacrifice of men like Samuel, a gradual change began to occur in his perspective. I hear Warren has requested permission to expand the curriculum, Riley commented, selecting a letter from the top of the pile. Apparently, he discovered 5 other similar cases during his research. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Genuine transformation or just trying to save his career? Maybe a little of both, Riley admitted. But maybe that's the real victory. Not just changing the historical record, but also the minds that interpret it. At Harborside, the restaurant where it all began, a remarkable change had also taken place. The manager, deeply embarrassed after the story went viral on military social media, had implemented a new policy. Framed photos of veterans of all eras and ethnic backgrounds now decorated the walls, including an enlarged photo of Samuel in his service days. More significantly, the restaurant now offered a monthly program where veterans could share their stories, creating a space for voices that had once been silenced to finally be heard. That night at the restaurant, Samuel reflected, his eyes distant as if watching the past, wasn't the first time I'd faced that kind of treatment. For decades, I learned to just walk away. What changed this time? Riley asked. Samuel contemplated the question for a moment. Maybe I was tired. Or maybe after all these years, I was finally ready for the truth to come out. He paused significantly. Or maybe it was just the right time and the right person to hear the story. On the Naval Academy campus, the memorial dedicated to the operators of the covert missions in Southeast Asia had become a place of reflection for cadets. Where once there were only the celebrated names of white commanders, now a more complete and honest story was told, including the names of those who, like Samuel, had been deliberately omitted from the official records. In military history classes, Samuel Washington's case was now required reading, not just as an example of courage in combat, but as a lesson in how institutional biases can distort the historical narrative. You know what's most ironic? Samuel said, pointing to a folder on the table, his copy of the declassified files. For decades, I convinced myself that silence was dignity, that I didn't need recognition to know my own worth. And you didn't, Riley replied. True, but what I never realized was how many other people needed this story. How many young black recruits needed to know that men like me existed, served, led. Samuel smiled softly. Silence protected my peace, but it denied others his inspiration. At the last meeting of the Retroactive Recognition Committee, something extraordinary happened. 5 new cases have been approved for review. All black special operations operators who had performed acts of extraordinary heroism during past conflicts. Even more surprising was who presented 2 of those cases, Captain Warren. His report was meticulous, detailed, and for the first time without a trace of condescension or resentment. People are rarely all good or all bad, Samuel observed as he read the news. Most of us live in the shadows between those extremes, needing only the right light to find a better path. On the 1-year anniversary of that night at the restaurant, Samuel Washington received a special invitation. The president wanted him at the White House for the launch of a new military history review initiative. At the ceremony, surrounded by high-ranking officers, politicians, and historians, Samuel, wearing a simple but elegant suit, the Medal of Honor shining on his chest, gave a short speech. History is never just about the past. It's about how we choose to shape our future through the lessons we learn from our collective experiences. For 50 years, I carried my story in silence, believing that recognition was less important than personal truth. Today I understand that some stories need to be told not only to correct past injustices but to prevent future injustices. As he concluded his speech, his eyes met those of Marcus Riley sitting in the front row, the young SEAL who had turned a simple recognized tattoo into a revolution in historical recognition. Never underestimate the power of a moment of recognition, Samuel concluded. Sometimes all we need is someone to truly see us, not just as we appear to be, but as we truly are. As the auditorium erupted in applause, Samuel Washington, at 77 years old, represented a powerful truth that justice, though sometimes slow, need not be forever denied. That history, when finally told with honesty, has the power to transform not only the past, but the present and the future. If this story of perseverance and belated recognition touched your heart, sign up to the Black Voices channel for more narratives that reveal heroes forgotten by official history. Because maybe somewhere near you, there is a Samuel Washington. Someone whose story of courage and sacrifice is still waiting to be told. Someone who just needs us to notice the invisible tattoo of his silent service.